On the afternoon of the 4th of April 2026, in Natchez, police were called to a house after the homeowner suddenly lost contact. A situation that seemed routine, but as soon as they stepped inside, they realized the atmosphere felt off from a normal state. The space was unnaturally tidy, the floor slick as if it had just been treated, a chemical smell still lingering in the air, creating the sense that someone had just tried to erase traces. So what had happened before they arrived, and why was there a need to clean so urgently? Then from downstairs came a rapid pounding sound, water hitting hard in repeated bursts, causing the entire team to pause for a few seconds. What was being handled at that exact moment? Behind a closed door, someone was still present, not leaving or showing any surprise at the sight of law enforcement. So what were they trying to finish? As the search area expanded to the surroundings, a discovery appeared outside the house that immediately shifted the entire direction of the investigation, from a routine check to a serious scene. What happened in the short window before the police entered, and if they had arrived just a few minutes later, would the entire truth have been completely concealed? In Natchez, the woman living in that house, Mrs. Lana Brown Bradley, was known as a retired teacher, with a stable routine, always staying in contact with her family, answering calls, replying to messages, actions repeated every day, forming a predictable rhythm of life. So, when one of her children received no response over a period of time, a sense of unease appeared almost immediately, not because the silence was too long, but because it was unlike her. The phone kept ringing. Messages were still being delivered, but there was no reply. The car was still parked in front of the house. Personal belongings remained in place. Every sign indicated she had not left. So, what happened during that time? And why would someone who always maintained communication suddenly disappear from all connections? From an investigative perspective, this was no longer a routine missing case, because when an individual with a clearly established pattern of life suddenly cuts off all communication, there is a high likelihood of a direct external factor. The question at this point was no longer where she was, but what had happened inside that house before the police were called, and more importantly, who was the last person to remain in that space. On the 4th of April 2026, after the eldest son reported that he had tried to contact his mother since the previous day, but she remained silent, Adams County deputies were dispatched to a house on Melanie Street in Natchez, Mississippi, to conduct a welfare check. On paper, this was still a familiar call. A concerned family, a loved one out of contact, law enforcement arriving to verify the situation inside. But just minutes after arriving, the sense of normalcy began to crack. The first thing that caught their attention was the smell of chemicals spreading throughout the house, as if someone had just used a strong cleaning agent, and the floor was unusually slick, giving the impression that the place had been thoroughly cleaned right before they stepped in. For a welfare check, that sign was significant, because they were there to find a missing woman, not to encounter a scene that had just been meticulously cleaned. The eldest son noticed it as well. According to Sheriff Travis Patton, he believed the way the younger brother had cleaned the house was very unusual because it went against his normal habits. And in an investigation, a detail that breaks a pattern can sometimes be more telling than an obvious trace. If the homeowner had simply gone somewhere, why were her wallet, phone, and car keys still here? If everything was simple, why was the floor surface slick, the smell of cleaner so strong, and several areas felt recently disturbed? Those elements made the house feel like it was telling a story that had been edited, where the most visible parts might be the least truthful. The police did not need to draw conclusions immediately, but the logic of the scene had already begun to shift. This did not look like an event that happened and then stopped. It looked like a period afterward, when someone stayed behind, observed what had just occurred, and then tried to make the place appear more normal before others arrived. The disturbing part was that the act of cleaning often suggests the person understood there was something that needed to be concealed. They knew which areas required attention, which spots could draw suspicion, and had enough time to intervene in the space before law enforcement arrived. So in the time between when the eldest son lost contact with his mother and when the deputies stepped through that door, who had been inside the house? What had that person seen? What had they touched? What traces had they tried to remove? The more they observed, the more the details pulled them away from the initial assumption. This might have been a quiet house on the outside, but inside, it carried many signs of a truth that had just been covered up. And while the deputies were still trying to understand why the place was suspiciously clean, another sound began to echo from downstairs, steady, forceful, more insistent than any other noise in the house. A sound that would lead them to a horrifying door. That sound was coming from downstairs, steady, strong, relentless, as if someone was trying to finish something urgently behind a closed door. For the police, this was no longer a minor detail, because everything before that had already been too unusual. The chemical smell, the slick floor, signs of selective cleaning, the homeowner's personal belongings still untouched, yet the person they were looking for was gone. Now, with the addition of that sound of water, the entire house was beginning to form a chain of signs that was hard to ignore. It did not sound like an ordinary household noise, nor like a random bathroom issue. It was happening at the exact moment law enforcement was inside, at the precise time they needed to determine where the homeowner was, and more importantly, it was coming from a place where someone had locked themselves inside. The closer they got, the clearer the question became. If everything was normal, why would the person inside let the water keep running instead of coming out to explain? This was the moment when the welfare check began to slip away from its original pattern. The police had not yet seen the full truth, but they had already heard part of it. In scenes that have been cleaned too thoroughly, sometimes what remains is not blood, fingerprints, or obvious evidence, but a sound appearing at the wrong time. At that point, the sound of water was like a clock running backward, each passing second potentially carrying away a piece of evidence. The person behind that door was still there, not leaving or seeming in any hurry to explain after realizing law enforcement had entered the house. That very continuation made everything heavier. They could not wait any longer, because if that sound was connected to what was being hidden, just a few minutes of delay could be enough to change the entire scene. And then, the deputies moved toward the downstairs bathroom door, where the sound of water was still continuing steadily, as if someone inside believed there was still time. This was the point where all the earlier suspicions began to focus on one single location. The house showed signs of being cleaned. The homeowner had not appeared. Her personal belongings were still untouched, and behind that door was the only person creating movement in the entire space. When law enforcement approached the bathroom, they knew they needed to open it immediately, because if that sound was connected to evidence disposal, every passing second could mean more evidence being lost. Inside was Zachary Lavel Jackson Jr., the youngest son of the woman they were searching for. What made the situation stand out was his reaction. Instead of coming out to explain, calling his mother, asking what was happening, or appearing confused by the presence of police, Zachary remained in the bathroom next to the running water. He did not panic or try to leave the scene. The way he was present there created a very strange feeling, because during welfare checks, a normal person usually reacts immediately when law enforcement enters their home, especially when a family member has been reported out of contact. They would ask questions, they would worry, they would try to prove that everything was just a misunderstanding. But here, the silence and calm demeanor became a sign that was hard to ignore. Police looked at the situation in front of them and began to understand that they were not simply speaking with a family member. They were standing before someone who may have known exactly what had happened inside this house before they arrived. The question was whether Zachary was there by coincidence or because he was trying to finish something that had not yet been completed. If the mother was still safe, why had he locked himself inside the downstairs bathroom at the exact moment police appeared? If this was all just a misunderstanding, why did the house show signs of cleaning? Why was there the sound of rushing water? And why was a relative positioned in the most suspicious place? Every detail from earlier now began to connect, from the chemical smell on the floor, to the homeowner's unusual absence, to the sound coming from behind the door. No one needed to state a conclusion yet, but the direction of the investigation had changed. Zachary's calmness was no longer a harmless expression, but seemed like part of a larger picture. And as soon as the deputies' eyes shifted down toward the toilet area, they saw the first thing that officially pushed the entire welfare check into a more serious level. At this point, every suspicion centered on one place. The house had just been cleaned. The homeowner had disappeared. Her personal belongings were still in their original places. And behind that door, someone was still making noise. When the bathroom was opened, they saw Zachary Lavel Jackson Jr., the youngest son of the woman they were searching for. He was there, right next to the toilet. What caught the police's attention was not only Zachary's location, but the way he reacted. He did not leave or appear surprised when he saw law enforcement. He also did not ask where his mother was, did not explain why the door was locked, and made no effort to clarify what was happening. That calmness immediately became a sign. An innocent person would usually react instinctively when police enter the home looking for their mother. Worry, confusion, questions, an attempt to prove that everything was just a misunderstanding. Zachary was different. He was standing right where the sound of water was coming from, inside a house that smelled of chemicals, with a slick floor, signs of cleaning, and a mother who still had not appeared. Nothing felt separate anymore. Everything began to connect in one direction. Police understood that the person in front of them might know more than he was showing. The question now was no longer why he was in the bathroom, but what he had been doing before the door was opened. And when the deputies' eyes shifted down toward the toilet, they saw the first detail that officially pushed the case beyond the scope of a welfare check. From the detail in the bathroom, the case immediately moved beyond the scope of one house. Police understood that if traces had been handled inside, the rest may have already been taken outside. The property around the house on Melanie Street covered about 2 acres, surrounded by dense trees, with a bayou and creeks nearby, meaning if evidence had been thrown outside, just a few hours could be enough to make the search much harder. The situation became even more urgent because the weather was turning bad. A storm was approaching, and rain could wash away traces, disturb the ground, or cause what remained to disappear before investigators could collect it. Sheriff Travis Patton ordered the search area expanded immediately and called for additional support from the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. At that point, the house was only the starting point, while the truth could be scattered somewhere behind it. The family went in one direction, while the deputies moved in another. Every step through the dense trees felt heavier, because they did not yet know what they were looking for. But everyone understood that whatever they found would change the entire case. Then a scream rang out. Someone shouted, "That's the head." Just that one sentence was enough to freeze everything. It was no longer a feeling, nor was it just suspicion. From that moment, the welfare check officially turned into a homicide investigation. The discovery outside the house showed that this crime did not stop in the bathroom, nor was it contained within a single act. It had been pulled out of the original space, passing through multiple steps, multiple locations, and multiple attempts to process it. As investigators continued to search the area, they also discovered a suitcase containing part of the body. This detail was extremely important because it showed that the person responsible had not only tried to make evidence disappear through the water system, but had also used another method to move or conceal the remaining parts. A second scene began to form right in front of them. The woods behind the house, the damp ground, the nearby creek, the suitcase, the scattered traces. This was the kind of scene that forced investigators to change their approach. They could not look only at where the original incident took place, but had to read the entire property like a map of the crime. Every location could be a piece of the puzzle. Every disturbed patch of ground could lead to evidence. Every object out of place could reveal the killer's path of movement. The most disturbing point lay in how the behavior continued after the victim had already died. If someone commits a crime and then runs away, that is one type of reaction. But here, someone stayed, cleaned, divided the scene into multiple parts, used both the inside of the house and the outside area to conceal the truth that showed time, control, and a certain level of calculation. From the sound of water echoing in the bathroom to the scream from the woods, the entire story had shifted direction. The house was no longer the only place holding a secret. It was merely the center of a larger scene, where every step taken to handle the aftermath left traces in a different way. And the more police searched, the more they realized the question was no longer where the victim was, but what the killer had done with each part of the truth before they had time to step inside. That question forced investigators to look back at the entire scene in a different way. What they found in the bathroom, the suitcase outside the house area, the body parts discovered in the dense wooded area, all of it showed that this was a chain of actions that continued after the victim had died. According to the allegations from authorities, the body had been divided into multiple parts, then handled in two different directions. One part was hidden, while the rest was allegedly attempted to be destroyed through the drainage system. This is what made the case especially serious. Because if an act happens in a sudden outburst, the person responsible usually reacts in chaos, runs away, hides things temporarily, or leaves the scene almost intact. But inside the house on Melanie Street, the signs pointed in the opposite direction. There was a chemical smell. There was a slick floor. There was running water coming from the downstairs bathroom. There was a suitcase containing part of the body. There was evidence that had been taken out of the house. There was a detail that forced police to call a plumber to remove the toilet. Each thing on its own was already suspicious, but when placed together, they formed a clearer sequence: commit the crime, process the scene, scatter the traces, then continue trying to make what remained disappear. What stands out is the time involved. Whoever did this needed to stay long enough to clean, move things, choose locations, use the bathroom, take part of it outside, then return and continue hiding it. That is why Sheriff Travis Patton believed this was a calculated act, not just a moment of losing control that ended right afterward. When a person spends time after a crime dividing the scene into multiple points, they are trying to create breaks in the investigation. They want police to see one part, miss another, or lose enough time for the evidence to be destroyed. But the problem is, that plan was not complete. The water was still running when law enforcement stepped inside. The accused was still inside the bathroom. The cleaning traces were still too fresh. The chemical smell was still covering the house. The victim's personal belongings had still not been dealt with. The divot. It was the details that had not disappeared in time that turned against the person behind the incident. In a criminal investigation, concealment can sometimes say more than the original act itself, because it shows the person responsible understood what they had just done. A person who truly loses complete control may panic, leave everything behind, and flee the scene. Here, authorities alleged that Zachary did something different: stayed, cleaned, divided, hid, flushed, and continued processing things even as police had already been called. That creates a question more important than the initial motive. How much time did he think he still had, and how much did he think police would find? The suitcase showed an intent to conceal by moving. The drainage system showed an intent to destroy by making evidence leave plain sight. The large property behind the house showed another direction of disposal, where trees, mud, rainwater, and creeks could make the search far more difficult. When pieced together, the picture no longer existed inside one room, but stretched across both the house and the surrounding land. This was a layered scene, and each layer reflected a decision. The decision to mop the floor, the decision to use chemicals, the decision to lock himself in the bathroom, the decision to place part of the body in a suitcase, the decision to take evidence outside. All of it showed that the person responsible was trying to control the story before anyone else had time to step in. But truth has one major weakness against any plan of concealment. The more someone interferes, the more new traces they leave behind. Every act of cleaning may erase one thing, but it creates another abnormal sign. Every time evidence is moved, it may leave its original position, but it also opens another path to trace. Every action meant to cover something up accidentally proves that there was something that needed to be covered up, and that is why this reconstruction matters. It helps viewers understand that the case is not only shocking because of the final outcome, but because of what happened afterward. The alleged killer did not just want the victim to disappear. He also wanted the scene to lie for him, but the house, the bathroom, the suitcase, the woods, the chemical smell, and the running water told a different story. A story showing that he believed he could hide everything until police arrived earlier than planned. A story showing that he believed he could hide everything until police arrived earlier than planned. But to understand why everything reached this point, investigators had to go back to the day before, when the conflict inside the house on Melanie Street began to become more visible. According to Sheriff Travis Patton, the victim had gone to court the previous day to begin the process of having Zachary removed from the home. This is a very important detail because it turns the case from an act that seemed senseless into a conflict with a specific trigger point. The mother had reached her limit. She wanted to remove her youngest son from the place where she lived, and according to authorities, Zachary had threatened her before the body was discovered. If this information is accurate, according to the investigative record, then the timing of the case was very close to that eviction action. This makes the question of motive begin to become clearer. Was being forced out of the house what created such a violent reaction from him? In many family-related cases, the danger often increases sharply when the victim begins to set a final boundary. Before that, there may be tension, arguments, and prolonged instability, but when someone decides to ask the court to intervene, the relationship enters a different stage. It sends a clear message. Things have gone beyond what the family can endure. For an ordinary person, that is a legal procedure. For the accused in this case, it may have been seen as removal, a loss of control, or a direct blow to his position inside the house. This is not yet a final conclusion about motive, because investigators still have to prove the evidence in court, but it shows that the case is difficult to view as random. There was a timeline. There was a legal action. There was a threat mentioned by the sheriff. And right after that, the woman who had tried to remove her son from the home disappeared inside the very place where she lived. The frightening part lies in how close these events were to each other. The day before, she went to court. The next day, the family lost contact. Then police entered a house filled with the smell of chemicals, a slick floor, the sound of water from the downstairs bathroom, and traces scattered across the property. If each detail is viewed separately, they are already unusual enough. When placed in sequence, they create a very cold line. Conflict, threat, eviction process, loss of contact, cleaning the scene, disposing of evidence. That helps viewers understand why this part of the motive matters. It shows that the case may have begun with a boundary the victim finally decided to set. But that boundary appeared before a reaction far beyond anything imaginable. Because even if there was family conflict, even if being asked to leave the home made Zachary angry, the level of alleged brutality still went far beyond an ordinary reaction. This is the point that needs to be analyzed carefully. Motive may explain why the conflict erupted, but it is not enough to explain how the scene was handled afterward. A person can become angry after being forced out of a home. A person can react violently when they feel they are losing shelter, losing control, losing their place in the family. But staying behind, cleaning, spreading traces across multiple locations, using the bathroom, using a suitcase, extending the scene outside onto the property, All of it shows that the story went beyond the initial burst of anger. It moved into the territory of calculation, control, and an attempt to erase the truth. That is why the motive in this case is both clear and incomplete. Clear in the sense that there was a conflict close to the time of the incident. Incomplete in the sense that no one can fully answer yet why the reaction became so extreme. According to the sheriff, the family had suspected that Zachary had mental health issues. But Travis Patton also emphasized that mental instability does not automatically mean a loss of cognitive ability. He said Zachary was intelligent, had studied precision piping, had a certain technical background, and in his view, this behavior was calculated. This is the piece that makes the case heavier. If someone understands how systems operate, understands pipes, understands where evidence can be pushed away, then the action inside the downstairs bathroom takes on a different meaning. It was not necessarily pure panic. It may have been a choice. And when a choice is made after a crime, investigators will look at it as evidence of awareness. So, did Zachary act out of anger after the eviction process? Because of instability that had been building over a long period of time? Or because both factors collided at a dangerous moment? The final answer belongs to the court record, evaluations, and the trial process. But by this point, one thing had become clear. The victim appeared to have felt the need to protect herself through the legal system. She tried to have him removed from the home. And only a very short time later, that house became the place concealing one of the most shocking cases in Adams County. What remains for viewers to think about is this. If the eviction process was the trigger point, then before April 4, how many warning signs had appeared that the outside world had never seen? If there had already been many warning signs before April 4 that the outside world had never seen, then the next question becomes heavier. What had the family recognized in Zachary beforehand? According to Sheriff Travis Patton, when he spoke with nearly every member of the family, almost everyone believed Zachary had mental health issues. And many even felt that something dangerous was only a matter of time. This is a highly important detail because it shows that this case may have been foreshadowed by quiet signs in everyday life through behavior, emotional states, or changes that family members could sense most clearly. But recognizing that someone is showing signs of instability does not mean immediate intervention is possible. The sheriff also emphasized that family, friends, and even the community can sometimes only do so much, especially when an adult refuses to accept help and has not yet been considered a direct threat at that moment. This is the most dangerous gap in many family tragedies. Someone may make relatives feel afraid, create unease, make everyone cautious. But the legal system still requires a clear threshold before stronger action can be taken. And when that threshold has not been crossed on paper, every warning often gets trapped between fear and helplessness. This case is even more complicated because the victim appeared to have reached the final step within her power. She went to court to request that Zachary be removed from the home. According to the sheriff, he had threatened her the day before. That means the family had reason to worry. The victim had reason to act. But the tragedy still happened before protection could create a safe distance. This point pushes the case beyond the simple question of whether Zachary was unstable or not. The deeper question is, when a person shows signs of danger but still has the ability to think, plan, and control their behavior, how should society understand that risk? Travis Patton was very clear. Mental instability does not necessarily mean a loss of cognitive ability. He described Zachary as intelligent, someone who had studied precision piping, had technical knowledge, and in his assessment, the alleged behavior was calculated. This detail changes the way we look at what happened in the downstairs bathroom. If someone understands plumbing systems, understands flow, understands how material can be pushed out of sight, then the sound of water echoing as police entered carries an entirely different meaning. It does not look like a purely panicked reaction. It looks like a deliberate effort carried out while that person believed he still had enough time. This is the key point in the psychological part. The danger in this case may lie in the mixture of instability and awareness. On one side were the signs that made the family afraid. On the other was the ability to think after the act, shown through cleaning, using chemicals, locking himself in the bathroom, spreading traces across multiple locations, hiding part of the body in a suitcase, and sending another part into the drainage system. If someone loses control for only a few seconds, the scene usually remains instinctively chaotic. But here, authorities described a longer process, with one step followed by another, and methods meant to make the search more difficult. That makes the case more frightening, because it suggests the accused may have both caused the people around him to recognize something was wrong and still remained clear-headed enough to hide the result of the act. And this is also why families often find themselves in such a difficult position. They may sense danger before there is concrete evidence. They may live beside someone who makes them uneasy, but still not have enough grounds to force the system to intervene immediately. By the time the victim went to court, everything seemed to have reached its limit. But her limit became the final point of collision. From an investigative perspective, Zachary's psychological state cannot be concluded based only on a few descriptions from relatives or the sheriff's assessment. It requires medical records, legal evaluations, and the trial process. But based on what has been released, one thing can be seen. This is not simply the story of a person who became completely lost after a few impulsive seconds. It is the story of signs that had existed, warnings that were trapped, a victim trying to create a boundary, and a suspect accused of responding with an act that was both brutal and deliberately concealed. That is why this case shook Adams County so deeply. It forces people to look back at a very uncomfortable question. If many people had already felt that something was going to happen, why was no one able to stop it before police had to step into the house on Melanie Street? If many people had already felt that something was going to happen, why was no one able to stop it before police had to step inside the house on Melanie Street? That question still does not have a clear answer. But by the 28th of April, 2026, the case had entered its first legal stage when Zachary Lavel Jackson Jr. appeared in Adams County Justice Court. This time, the focus had moved away from the scene. The chemical smell, the running water, the suitcase, the woods behind the house, all of it became evidence for the court to begin looking at a larger issue. Did authorities have enough grounds to move the case forward? Zachary was facing extremely serious charges, including first-degree murder, second-degree murder, mayhem, and tampering with physical evidence. This was not a sentence, but the charges filed at the early stage of prosecution, so legally, he was still considered a defendant until the court reached a final conclusion. But what made that hearing notable was one decision. Zachary waived his right to a preliminary hearing. For many outside viewers, this detail may pass by very quickly. But in a criminal case, a preliminary hearing is the point where prosecutors must present their initial basis, while the defense has an opportunity to hear, evaluate, and sometimes challenge part of the evidence. When a defendant waives this step, the case is usually moved to the next stage more quickly instead of being argued early in court. That does not mean he pleaded guilty. It also does not prove the defense attorney's final strategy, but it suggests the defense may be choosing to hold back its response, wait for a more complete record, or prepare for a longer legal fight ahead. This is why this part matters. A case that is shocking at the scene is not necessarily simple in court. The more brutal the details, the more tightly the legal process must be handled, because every piece of evidence needs to be collected properly, preserved through the correct procedure, and analyzed according to the right standards. Just one mistake in the way the scene was processed, in the chain of custody, or in the initial statements could become a point for the defense to exploit. Prosecutors will have to prove the act, the intent, the sequence, and the defendant's level of awareness. The defense may focus on his mental state, capacity for responsibility, or the interpretation of each action after the incident occurred. So the story did not end at the moment Zachary was found in the bathroom. It simply moved into a different space, where every detail would be dissected through legal language. His appearance in court, escorted by multiple officers, seeming indifferent and even talking in the courtroom, also fueled public outrage. But public emotion and the standards of the court are two different things. People may already have an answer in their minds, while the justice system still has to move through each step. That is why this case will continue, not only to determine what Zachary did, but also to answer the harder question: how much did he understand when those actions happened? And will the entire chain of concealment after the crime be enough to prove calculation in court? From here, the case moved away from the house on Melanie Street, but the shadow of that scene would still follow every hearing. If many people had already felt that something was going to happen, why was no one able to stop it before police had to step inside the house on Melanie Street? That question still does not have a clear answer. But by the 28th of April, 2026, the case had entered its first legal stage when Zachary Lavel Jackson Jr. appeared in Adams County Justice Court. This time, the focus had moved away from the scene. The chemical smell, the running water, the suitcase, the woods behind the house, all of it became evidence for the court to begin looking at a larger issue. Did authorities have enough grounds to move the case forward? Zachary was facing extremely serious charges, including first-degree murder, second-degree murder, mayhem, and tampering with physical evidence. This was not a sentence, but the charges filed at the early stage of prosecution, so legally, he was still considered a defendant until the court reached a final conclusion. But what made that hearing notable was one decision. Zachary waived his right to a preliminary hearing. For many outside viewers, this detail may pass by very quickly. But in a criminal case, a preliminary hearing is the point where prosecutors must present their initial basis, while the defense has an opportunity to hear, evaluate, and sometimes challenge part of the evidence. When a defendant waives this step, the case is usually moved to the next stage more quickly instead of being argued early in court. That does not mean he pleaded guilty. It also does not prove the defense attorney's final strategy, but it suggests the defense may be choosing to hold back its response, wait for a more complete record, or prepare for a longer legal fight ahead. This is why this part matters. A case that is shocking at the scene is not necessarily simple in court. The more brutal the details, the more tightly the legal process must be handled, because every piece of evidence needs to be collected properly, preserved through the correct procedure, and analyzed according to the right standards. Just one mistake in the way the scene was processed, in the chain of custody, or in the initial statements could become a point for the defense to exploit. Prosecutors will have to prove the act, the intent, the sequence, and the defendant's level of awareness. The defense may focus on his mental state, capacity for responsibility, or the interpretation of each action after the incident occurred. So the story did not end at the moment Zachary was found in the bathroom. It simply moved into a different space, where every detail would be dissected through legal language. His appearance in court, escorted by multiple officers, seeming indifferent and even talking in the courtroom, also fueled public outrage. But public emotion and the standards of the court are two different things. People may already have an answer in their minds, while the justice system still has to move through each step. That is why this case will continue, not only to determine what Zachary did, but also to answer the harder question: how much did he understand when those actions happened? And will the entire chain of concealment after the crime be enough to prove calculation in court? From here, the case moved away from the house on Melanie Street, but the shadow of that scene would still follow every hearing. From here, the case moved away from the house on Melanie Street, but the shadow of that scene still followed every hearing. For the Adams County community, this was never just an unfamiliar name on the news. The woman at the center of the case was a retired teacher, someone who had once stood in the classroom, who had been connected to generations of students, and who had been spoken of by colleagues with respect. She also wrote poetry, and according to her family, those works had once been prepared for publication. A life like that should have been remembered through legacy, through warmth, through what she had given to others. But after April 4, her name became tied to a scene that shook the entire city of Natchez. That is what the family had to face: losing a mother, a loved one, and then having to watch the way her death was retold before the public. That is why her daughter asked for sensitivity when speaking about the case. That request is very important, because no matter how much true crime analyzes, it still begins with the real pain of a real family. Behind every investigative detail was someone who had lived, loved, had routines, dreams, and relationships of her own. If viewers only look at the level of brutality, it becomes easy to forget who the victim was before the case happened. And in this story, that is what needs to be held onto before closing the video. Lana Brown Bradley once had a place in the community, and her death forced people to look again at how danger can grow inside the place that feels most familiar. A home once considered safe became the center of an investigation. A family conflict that seemed to exist only behind private doors ended with police, search warrants, a courtroom, and questions that still cannot be fully answered. What had been building before that day? Were there signs that had once been overlooked? Who had seen the instability but been limited by the law, by family distance, or by a sense of helplessness? Those questions will remain longer than the first news report, because they touch a very real fear. Sometimes danger does not appear in the form of a stranger on the street, but exists inside the closest relationship. And when the truth was finally found, it was no longer contained in one room, but stretched from the bathroom to the house to the land behind it, and then into the entire community that once believed it understood the place it lived in. This case has not ended with a clean answer. It still has to move through the courts, through evidence, through legal arguments, and through the pain of those left behind. But one thing is clear: the silence of a mother brought police to that house. The sound of running water led them to the locked door. And what they found afterward forced Natchez to look directly at a tragedy it will not easily forget. The most frightening thing may not be what happened, but the fact that it happened inside a house that was once considered safe.